Good morning for you, Craig.
Hello, Frank.
It's nice to see you again, even though virtually. I wanted to talk to you again today because we you are part, as I am in a way, of the Gaza Tribunal, which is a citizen popular tribunal focusing on what's happening in Gaza, but obviously putting this into the broader context of Palestine. And the first, not session, but the first, yeah, I'm going to say the first session of the tribunal happened on May 26th, May 29th, I think, in Sarajevo. And I wanted to ask you a few questions about it because we are in a moment where a lot of people, including international lawyers and international jurists, are kind of wondering what international law and international humanitarian law is good about. So I wanted to ask you first, like a really basic question: what is the Gaza Tribunal?
Well, Frank, for the benefit of your listeners, because you know this very well, having been associated with the Gaza Tribunal, and even more so, having played an important leadership role in the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, gosh, more than a decade ago, I guess now, that this is a prodigy of something called the People's Tribunal that originated in the 1960s, of course, during U.S. aggression and atrocities in Vietnam, a recognition by people in society that these were crimes and that the U.S. was perpetrating them with absolute impunity at the time, and that no international institution or group of states was coming to end those atrocities that were being perpetrated. And that was the context in which Bertrand Russell, the prominent British philosopher and public intellectual, launched the first People's Tribunal as a kind of organized expression of moral outrage. And, he immediately distinguished these kinds of exercises from formal courtrooms. He said, we are not judges, we are witnesses. And our task is to make humankind bear witness to these terrible crimes and to unite humanity on the side of justice. And there have been several exercises in this kind of People's Tribunal since that, more than 60 years ago, was launched. As I said, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine over a decade ago. And now, in the wake of the upsurge in genocidal assaults in Gaza 600 days ago, this Gaza Tribunal was launched. As you say, we just had our first public meeting in Sarajevo from 26 to 29 May, which is where we adopted the Declaration of Sarajevo. It was actually put together a bit earlier. It met in February in London. It's been basically bringing together public intellectuals, thinkers, activists from across Palestine and around the world to conduct this process. It was initiated by another prominent public intellectual, a guy called Richard Falk. Many know him as a preeminent professor of international law, former UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Palestine. He is now the president of the Gaza Tribunal, but lots of other folks as well associated with this exercise, not only to address the colonial genocide that's being perpetrated in Palestine by the Israeli regime, but also the complicity of powerful states and corporations and media companies and Israel proxy groups in the West, as well as the inaction or at least inadequate response of the majority of countries and institutions in the world, including at the international level. And the tribunal is scheduled around so-called chambers. There's a focus on international law, another one on international relations and world order, another that looks at the various facets of history and ethics and philosophy, all focused on the realities on the ground in Palestine. Ultimately, we will be convening a jury of conscience in the coming months to pronounce on the situation. We're compiling an archive of evidence to be made available to the public and to those who are pursuing accountability initiatives. And as I said, we adopted the Declaration of Sarajevo, encapsulating kind of our vision for a global moral response to what is an ongoing Nakba in Palestine.
So what you're saying is that the remit of the tribunal, is it to answer the question, is it genocide or not, or or is it broader than that? Or does it include the question, but then goes further than that?
Well, it's interesting because we begin with a recognition that has been pronounced upon by every major international human rights organization, that has been found plausible by the International Court of Justice, that has been declared by independent human rights mechanisms, by genocide scholars and others, of the reality of the genocide, right? We have a lot of very skilled international lawyers on the tribunal, but it's not a formal judicial or legal mechanism, and so we are not constrained in the way that courts are actually constrained. We don't believe that we have to wait for a final pronouncement made by some international court years down the road in the face of what is a historic exigency like genocide. And we don't think that passive deference to official institutions is morally defensible in circumstances like that. So we begin with the recognition of genocide. We begin with the recognition of apartheid and settler colonialism, which are now, by now, for anyone paying attention, undeniable realities. They have long been confirmed by experts and by institutions around the world. And there's no doubt about what's happening on the ground. As you know, this genocide has been called the world's first live-streamed genocide. It's the first genocide where those perpetrating it have declared their genocidal intent out loud over and over again in public. And yet you have official institutions still debating whether the night is falling, as the people in Palestine are already living in the darkness. So the tribunal views this as an urgent moral imperative to confront these crimes with all the power that can be mobilized in civil society, and without the constraints that are imposed on more official institutions.
So if you start with genocide and apartheid, where do you want to go? What's like the journey?
Well, we want to identify accountabilities. We want to identify a just course on what needs to happen in practical terms. We want to identify measures for protection of the vulnerable, redress for victims, accountability for perpetrators, for a real response to the horrors that we have all been witnessing. And we want to also blow away the rhetoric of institutions and states that have been complicit in the genocides. For example, we don't take this both sides approach to a situation like Palestine that is insisted on even by some in the UN, right? That these are two sides involved in a conflict. No, the two sides are colonizer and colonized. The two sides are occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, and now genocidaire and victims. And, this kind of cowardice of refusing to take sides in a genocide is something that we wholeheartedly reject. We also reject this Israel exception to international law that has been buttressed over and over again by Western powers and picked up to some degree by international institutions. If either the law is the law and it applies to all equally, or it's a lie. It's a perfidious weapon to oppress certain groups and to subjugate people in the hands of power. We believe in the rule of law. Means that these rules of international law are applicable to all states and to all persons. We also have refused in our analysis, as many institutions have embraced, but we have refused these kind of Israeli-imposed gag orders that are enforced by Western allies and their proxies, even complicit media corporations, because we think you cannot resolve a crisis of any kind without looking at root causes. And the root causes for official institutions have been pushed aside and ignored willfully. There are so many words that these institutions refuse to utter, like Zionism and settler colonialism, ethno-supremacism, apartheid. These are the roots of the problem, and you cannot come to a just and peaceful resolution of any situation without addressing those kinds of root causes, which the tribunal is committed to addressing very directly, not diverting its eyes, not avoiding the word genocide. We have even the highest officials in the UN that continue to use this rhetorical trick to avoid talking about genocide, where they will say, whenever they're pressed, well, only a court can declare genocide. Well, that may be true, right? But it is not a moral statement. These same actors never hesitate to talk about other crimes, like war crimes or torture or summary executions or any other violations of international law, but they've imposed a gag order on themselves not to talk about genocide. And unless it is in retrospect. You can talk about historic genocides, but you can't talk about genocides happening now, and you absolutely cannot talk about genocide in Palestine. We reject that. We will talk about these realities and seek just solutions to what it is that we are witnessing, and not fall into this kind of rhetorical trap that has been set by others. So we will, in all of that, we are, as I said, are also putting together an archive of evidence that will be made to all of those who can put it to use. We will have these findings of our jury of conscience. We will have the Sarajevo Declaration, other contributions that the tribunal will be making from civil society, from social movements, from thinkers, from influential personalities in society, to join the growing call of solidarity with the Palestinian people for the historic injustices that they've been subjected to, and now this ongoing genocide. That's the task.
So are you saying that, I mean, obviously it's called a people's tribunal or a citizens tribunal. So are you saying that your audience is the people, or are you also trying, because I mean the people involved are very respected, some of the most actually respected lawyers and jurists and philosophers in the world. Is your aim still also to try to talk to power and to influence power, or it's really to talk to us, in a way 99%?
Well, it's both. It is the mobilization of solidarity. It is the mobilization of public pressure. We know, for example, that official institutions, even official courts like the ICJ and the ICC, are not immune to public pressure. They are being subjected to enormous pressures by Israeli and American intelligence agencies, by U.S. sanctions and others, by slander campaigns, by Israel proxy groups. These courts are being subjected to enormous pressures to do the wrong thing, to not hold Israel and its individual perpetrators accountable. A part of the task of justice is making sure that the pressure in the other direction, the pressure on institutions to do the right thing, is more powerful than the pressure that they're receiving to do the wrong thing. And that pressure will come from the millions and billions, from the people who are insisting that these institutions do the right thing. The same is true for UN institutions, for individual member states, some of which are not going to be affected. The government of the United States, the government of Israel, the principal co-perpetrators in the genocide, are not going to be turned around by calls for justice or human rights. They're not going to be turned around by popular will. But what can be done is, and as the Sarajevo Declaration points out, is that real pressures can be mobilized, that support can be built for a broader action around boycott and divestment and sanctions and prosecutions and legal initiatives and civil disobedience and protest and dissent and a refusal on the part of people in their millions to normalize genocide, to normalize apartheid, to normalize settler colonialism, and to dissent in their own institutions, in their own countries, before their own governments, to create pressure in the same way that the Russell Tribunal, the original Russell Tribunal, could not in its own right stop the horrors that the U.S. was perpetrating in Vietnam. But at the same time, nobody would deny that it contributed to the growing movement of dissent against the Vietnam War that ultimately forced a change in U.S. policy there. Together, of course, with the popular resistance of the Vietnamese people and a global solidarity movement. These are all contributions to that. The same can be said of the civil rights movement in the United States during apartheid in the U.S., which was called Jim Crow here. It took a very long time, a lot of mobilization, first by those who were being subjected to persecution on the basis of race, but also the solidarity movements around them, boycotts and other sorts of activities that created pressure for change. The same can be said of the movement against apartheid in South Africa. In the U.S., for example, the U.S. supported the apartheid regime straight through the 1980s. It had Nelson Mandela designated as a terrorist straight through 4 years after he was released from prison, ultimately became president. He was still officially a terrorist to the Americans. but it was a movement of people. It was churches and synagogues and mosques and labor unions and social movements and civil society and NGOs and just decent human beings in the country and around the world that came together in solidarity that created pressure that made it difficult to sustain the immoral policy of the US, the UK, European countries in the West supporting apartheid in South Africa. That's what these movements are all about. This is one people's element of that, a people's tribunal. Others have sprung up. There's a people's march being organized to Gaza across the Sinai. There is, as we speak, a Freedom Flotilla, a people's humanitarian flotilla sailing toward Gaza at tremendous risk, but based in tremendous principle. And there are people despite unprecedented repression, who are protesting on university campuses, in capitals around the world, in workplaces and elsewhere, even though they are facing suspension, expulsion, firing, slander and smearing as anti-Semites and supporters of terrorism, as the smears go, arrests and beatings by police, detention and imprisonment. Despite all of that growing repression, unprecedented repression, those movements are growing. And all of us need to find ways to be a part of growing those movements. And this Declaration of Sarajevo and the Gaza Tribunal are just one contribution to that growing movement.
Yeah, can you actually go into more details about the Sarajevo Declaration itself? What does it say? What does it give? Like, I guess, the tribunal is also a way to give tools, to the movement, right? So, yeah, I was wondering if you can say a few words about the Sarajevo Declaration. And I know that it's actually an incredible and tremendous and hard job that you all have done, because when you have, 30, 35 people, brains, legal expert, philosopher in the same room, and you have to agree and to find a consensus on a declaration, it's actually a momentous effort. So, thank you and the team, because I know how tough this was.
You've been through it, absolutely. Well, I think that's right. I think the common thread that brings all of this very diverse group together of historians and lawyers and philosophers and policy analysts and people from Palestine, from all around the world, the common thread holding them together is this very fundamental commitment to justice, to human rights, to basic human morality. And so you don't have anyone amongst all these dozens of people who are in any way corrupted by the institutional prejudices, the biases, the things that hold back a principled position in official institutions. These are people who genuinely care about human rights. And if you ask them the question, there's this set of facts, what is a just and moral outcome? People come to remarkably similar conclusions. And if the rules are the game is that we will not self-censor, we will tell the truth, you get very strong in principled language, as you will find in the Sarajevo Declaration, right? The Declaration is kind of an antidote to all of this moral obfuscation, all of these distorted narratives, all of the silent complicity that dominates official positions throughout this, not just throughout this period of genocide, but the whole 78 years. So it's a kind of appeal of conscience, right? And it begins with a declaration of moral outrage at what's happening and a declaration of solidarity with the people of Palestine and this commitment to building the movement, working with partners across global society to try to put an end to these things. It demands an immediate end to all of these crimes with no obfuscation. That means the occupation, the siege, the apartheid, the genocide, demands freedom for all Palestinian prisoners, so often neglected in discussions about what's happening on the ground, those thousands of Palestinians held without charge or trial in brutal conditions and brutalized while they are in the custody of the Israeli regime. It's a call on all governments and organizations to act. It denounces all of those who've been complicit, not just the Israeli regime, but all of those actors who have been complicit in the regime's crimes. And that means third states, it means media companies, arms corporations, energy and tech companies, Israel proxy groups, and others who have helped to make this continuing genocide possible. It takes a very clear position on racism and bigotry and discrimination, saying that this necessarily, if you are a just person who cares about the actual norms of human rights, that those commitments have to include an equal rejection of Islamophobia, of anti-Arab racism, of anti-Palestinian racism, and of anti-Semitism, as well as an acknowledgement of the horrible effects of Zionism and apartheid and settler colonialism on the Palestinian people. And it explicitly rejects what it calls the destructive ideology of Zionism as the official ideology of the Israeli regime. It calls for decolonization across all of historic Palestine, an end to the ethno-supremacist order that rules there now, and a replacement of a Zionist project with a new dispensation that's founded on equal human rights for all Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others, which you will seldom hear coming out of even of the halls of the UN. It also calls for specific action because the international system has failed. States have failed to challenge the genocide, to challenge the apartheid in Palestine, and to hold Israel accountable. So it calls for the isolation of the Israeli regime, for it to be contained and held accountable. It calls for a universal boycott and divestment and sanctions and a military embargo. It calls for Israel to be suspended from international organizations. Outrageous that after all these months of murdering UN personnel in record numbers, more than 310 UNRWA staff alone, murdered by the Israelis during the genocide, many along with their families, that Israel still walks around in the halls of the UN with full credentials and voting rights. That needs to end, according to the tribunal. It calls for criminal prosecution of perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, gross violations of human rights, and also of the crime of complicity practiced by so many during this period. It stands in solidarity with those who are defending human rights. It denounces, for example, the wave of persecution and crackdowns that human rights defenders are being subjected to, peace activists, the students, the academics, workers, and professionals. And it honors those who continue to stand up in spite of the persecution and smearing that they're subjected to. And specifically, it calls out this tactic of smearing as, anti-Semites or supporter of terrorism anyone who dares to speak up against the Israeli regime, against Israeli crimes, and so on. It very openly honors the courageous resistance and resilience of the Palestinian people and the movement of millions around the world who are standing in solidarity with them. It recognizes the rights of the Palestinian people to armed resistance in accordance with international law. And it recalls that the Palestinian right to self-determination is not something that's up for negotiation. It says that the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people is jus cogens, erga omnes, these legal terms saying that they are without exception and applicable universally, and that it is non-negotiable and axiomatic, according to the declaration. It insists on respect for Palestinian aspirations and full Palestinian agency and leadership over decisions affecting their lives. This is not the business of anyone in the United States or in Qatar or anywhere else. These decisions belong to the Palestinian people. They're human beings with human rights in essence. It does also recognize those institutions that have stepped up and that are doing their job. It praises, for example, the International Court of Justice for its historic genocide case against the Israeli regime, for its landmark advisory opinions on Palestine. It recognizes South Africa for bringing the genocide case to the ICJ and it recognizes the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for its cases, and demands that the U.S. cease its persecution of the court. And it recognizes the very principled and strong positions that have taken by the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council, like Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese and a dozen other special rapporteurs for their expert contributions, their strong and principled voice, and so on. And then while it is praising some international actors, it also declares particular support for humanitarian actors and international agencies that have consistently worked to defend the rights of the Palestinian people, foremost among them UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agencies for Palestine Refugees, that has been under attack as a part of this genocide, and it stands in solidarity with them. I won't read the whole thing, Frank, but just to look at the ending. The declaration ends with this warning. It says that the world is approaching a dangerous precipice, the front edge of which is in Palestine. And it says that key international institutions in most countries of the world have failed in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people and in responding to the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine. And then it concludes with this, and I'll read the quote. Quote, "The challenge of justice now falls to people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, to all of us. As such, our work in the coming months will be dedicated to meeting this challenge. Palestinian lives are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We will not relent." End of quote. That's how it concludes, and that's very much the call to action of the tribunal and how it will focus its work in the coming months.
Thanks, Greg. My last question, and you can be brief if you want. So what are the next steps of the tribunal? If I know it's an organic process, but do you already know what's happening next?
Well, the next steps are to assemble the jury of conscience of prominent people of high moral standing who will make the ultimate declarations based upon all of the evidence and analysis and testimonies. The tribunal has listened to a number of victim testimonies, witness testimonies, expert testimonies. All of that will be brought together for the benefit of a jury of conscience. It will complete its work on the archive of evidence that will also be made available, not just to the jury of conscience, but to the world as well. It will continue to build its relations with civil society and movements around the world that are necessary to mobilize change, and all of this will be concluded in the coming months.
Thanks a lot, Craig. Yeah, it was. I think it's something that is that will, hopefully, again, be used as a tool by the movement, and hopefully, if it can be picked up also by the spheres of power, why not?
Absolutely. We at least have to try. And we've been very lucky, Frank, to have your experience and advice and engagement with the tribunal as well. So thank you very much for that. And thanks for continuing to have these conversations to help to enlighten
Thanks.
them. Yeah.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye, Frank.